So, we are still on the AD and AS model, that is aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, and today we are going to talk about aggregate supply. We have already talked about aggregate demand. So, just to refresh your memory, in aggregate demand, we talked about what is the shape of the aggregate demand curve, and we saw that the aggregate demand curve looks similar to the ordinary demand curve, that is, it is downward sloping. However, when you plot the aggregate demand curve in a two-dimensional space, it's representing the demand of the macroeconomy. So, on the x axis you do not have the quantity of a certain commodity, but you have the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy during that year, which is basically your GDP, and we took the price adjusted GDP over time. So, we have real GDP, our GDP on the x axis, and similarly on the y axis you do not have the dollar price of a commodity, unlike microeconomics or the ordinary demand curve model, but here you have the aggregated price of commodities, the average price of commodities, and an indicator of average price of commodities in the economy we said was the GDP deflator. So, on the y axis here you had the GDP deflator, and in that two-dimensional space your AD curve was downward sloping. Then we also looked into the four effects. We talked about the real balance effect, we talked about the wealth effect, we talked about the interest rate effect, the foreign income effect, and we also talked about the expectations of consumers and producers in the form of optimism and pessimism, and we saw what was the impact on the aggregate demand curve. We said that the real balance effect and the wealth effect, they showed up as movements on the aggregate demand curve, whereas the others would shift the aggregate demand curve either to the right or to the left, and as a result it would impact the real GDP of the economy. It would either cause growth, that means raise the real GDP, or cause stagnation, that is decrease the real GDP. Now, all that we have already covered. Now, in this video we are going to talk about aggregate supply. Now, basically aggregate supply is looking at the supply of total volume of goods and services in the economy during a year. So, basically we are looking at the same thing, but now we are looking at it from the perspective of the producers. So, we still have the same two-dimensional space, we still have real GDP, and we have the deflator, the GDP deflator. Once again reminding you, this is not a dollar value, this is just a real number because it is an index or an indicator. So, it could take values like 100, 200 or whatever, it won't be, dollar values. So, now in this two-dimensional space we need to track, or we need to trace, what is the nature of the aggregate supply of the economy. Now, what is the relationship between the GDP deflator and the real GDP when you look at it from the producer's perspective? Now, if you have a situation of rising prices in the economy, as in if you have inflation in the economy, that means prices are going up, then from a seller's perspective or a producer's perspective, they would be encouraged to produce more and supply more, because there is a prospect of making more money whenever those produced goods and services get sold in the market, right. So, whenever there is an inflation in the economy, that means a situation of rising prices. From the producer's perspective, there is an inclination to produce and supply more goods and services. And if all producers of goods and services in the country responded to the price rise in that way, it would take the total value of goods and services produced in the economy up, right. As a result of that, the real GDP would go up. So, that means you can see, unlike the demand side, on the supply side there is a direct relationship between that price index and the real GDP, owing to how the producers respond to that rise in prices. Similarly, if there was a situation of falling prices in the economy, right, that means a situation of deflation in the economy, then the producers would respond by producing less and supplying less, because now they are demotivated to sell the commodities, because it would fetch them lesser value, it would fetch them lesser money because the prices have gone down. That's the situation in the economy. And if all producers in the country respond that way, then it would take the total value of goods and services produced and supplied in the country go down, which means that the real GDP would go down. And this relationship would be true once again assuming that nothing else changes in the economy. So ceteris paribus, assuming everything else in the economy stays the same. If there is inflation, there is an increase in real GDP. If there is deflation, there is a decrease in real GDP, and this relationship could be easily tracked by an upward sloping line, and this upward sloping line is the aggregate supply curve of the economy. Okay. Now, unlike the demand side, on the supply side, we distinguish between the short run and the long run. So, we have a short run supply curve and we have a long run supply curve. We have the SRAS, that is the short run aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply, SRAS, and we have the LRAS or the long run aggregate supply. Okay. So, what we are drawing here, this upward sloping line which represents the positive relationship between price index and real GDP, this is our SRAS. So, the short run aggregate supply, this is the one that is upward sloping. We will come to the long run aggregate supply and we will also distinguish between what we mean by short run and long run in a minute. But before that, let us understand what are the factors that could shift the short run aggregate supply right or left. So, we have spoken on the demand side, we talked about interest rate effect, we talked about the foreign income effect, and we have talked about optimism and pessimism which could shift the aggregate demand curve. Now, let us see what are the factors that can shift the short run aggregate supply curve. The factors that could shift the short run aggregate supply are, first of all, the wages, the wage rate in the economy. Okay. If the wage rate in the economy went up, now you know wages is what is paid to labor, right, to the workers. It is the payment for factor that is labor. So, if the wages in the economy goes up, that means your labor has become more expensive. Let us represent wages as W. So, we are saying that if W goes up, it implies that labor is now more expensive in the economy. And you know, labor is an input that is used for most businesses, for most production processes. So, if wages go up, it means labor has become expensive, which basically means that the cost of production goes up, because now you have to hire labor at a higher price. So, the cost of producing anything that uses labor basically escalates, goes up whenever the wage rate is higher, right. So, this basically translates to a higher cost of production for any production process that would use labor, higher cost of production. And if that is true, then that would be a deterrent for producing more. If the cost of production is higher, then producers would not produce as much. Everything else staying the same, they would not want to produce as much, because now they are having a heavier cost of production. So, that would make the producers produce less, and if every producer in the economy who uses labor responds in that way, then it would take the aggregate supply of the economy, and remember, we are talking in terms of the short run aggregate supply, that would take the aggregate supply down. So, we are talking about a left shift. Remember, anything that is an increase causes a right shift, anything that is a decrease causes a left shift. So, since the aggregate supply is going down, that translates to a left shift, which means that with no inflation or deflation happening, the price index staying constant, there is a left shift of the short run aggregate supply to something like that, SRAS dash, and as a result of that, the real GDP of the economy goes down from say Y1 to Y2. Okay. So please remember, now by now you should know that whenever we are talking about shifts of the curves, the inherent assumption is that whatever is measured in the y-axis, that is fixed. So in this case, if we are talking about shifts of the aggregate supply curve, the underlying assumption is that there is no change in the price index. So no inflation or deflation happening in the economy, nothing else changing in the economy, only if the wage rate went up, then you would see a decrease in aggregate supply, which would be represented by a left shift of the short run aggregate supply curve to a new curve, that is short run aggregate supply dash, SRAS dash, and as a result of that, the real GDP of the economy would go down. The opposite would happen if wage rate went down. If there was a decrease in the wage rate, that would mean the cost of producing something, the cost of production now is lower. If cost of production is lower, then it is easier for producers to produce, and if that is true, then they would indeed produce more, so that the aggregate supply would now be higher, and now instead of a left shift, you would rather see a right shift of the short run aggregate supply curve. Once again, no inflation or deflation taking place in the economy, the inflation or deflation staying constant in the economy, the price index staying constant. Now you would see a right shift of the short run aggregate supply curve to something like SRAS double dash, and as a result of that, you would see a higher real GDP in the economy, something like Y3. Okay. So that is one factor. The wages are just one factor that can cause the shift of the aggregate supply curve, and it is indeed one of the most important factors. Now the other factor that could cause a shift of the aggregate supply curve in the short run, the second factor, is technology. Okay. If there is improvement in technology, if there is overall improvement in technology in the country, for example, let's say if you are talking about a developing country, let's say the developing country has suddenly imported, better technology from another developed country, right? So that means the overall technology of the country has improved, the overall technology of production in the country has improved, and such improvements in technology will cause a right shift of the short run aggregate supply, because you all know by now that better technology leads to higher production. So that would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right, because aggregate supply is going up. The opposite would happen if there is a disimprovement in technology. For whatever reason, if the technology of the country as a whole goes down, then once again, with no change in the price index, you would see a dip in the aggregate supply of the economy in the short run, as a result of which the short run aggregate supply would shift to the left. So that means better technology causes a right shift of aggregate supply, and hence takes the real GDP up, something similar to the purple line, and disimprovement in technology of the country would result in a decrease in the aggregate supply in the short run, causing a left shift of the curve, something similar to the red line that you see on the graph. Okay. Now I want to reiterate, and I keep doing this all the time because this is where most students would make mistake. Please note that whenever we are talking about shifts, whether we are talking about shift of the aggregate supply or we are talking about the shift of the aggregate demand, the implicit assumption is that there is no change in the price index. The price index is constant and something else in the economy is changing, which is driving this shift. And that something else in this context could be wages, or it could be technology in the country, the overall technology. The other factor which can cause a shift of the aggregate supply is basically commodity prices. Now this is a little confusing. When I say commodity prices, please note I am still not referring to a situation of inflation or deflation. By commodity prices, I am basically referring to input prices in the economy, overall prices of input. Why am I still calling it commodity prices? The reason I am calling it commodity prices is because if you remember, I have mentioned at some point earlier that every commodity is an input for some other producer. So, whatever I produce, whatever is my final commodity could be an intermediate commodity or an input for the production of another producer, right. So, basically most commodities that are produced or most services that are produced in the economy serves as an input for the production of another producer. For example, for Springfield Utility Company, they are producing electricity, and that electricity is being used by so many business units, right. So, what is the final product of the Springfield Utility Company becomes an input for some other producer. That is what we are talking about. So, basically we are talking about input prices, and it might benefit you to think about it as input prices. The only reason I am calling it commodity prices because most textbook would would use that nomenclature. So, I am using that, but it basically is referring to input prices. So, whenever input prices go up, okay, and in some sense this is similar to the wages, because wage, if you think about wage is also basically an input price. It is the price of labor, the input labor, right. So, labor is an input and the price of that input is wages, but we are just treating this separately because labor is a special input and it is the most important input that is used in most production processes. So, we are treating it separately, but the effect is on aggregate supply is exactly the same. If you have an increase in commodity prices, then that will take the cost of production up because you are spending more on inputs, and that will be a deterrent once again for producers to produce more. If cost of production goes up, most producers would produce less, so the aggregate supply would go down. As a result of that, you would see a left shift of the short run aggregate supply, similar to the red line. Okay. However, if the commodity prices go down, that means if input becomes cheaper in general, then the cost of production goes down, and most producers would respond to a decrease in cost of production by producing more, and as a result of that, the aggregate supply of the economy in the short run would go up. There would be a right shift of the curve similar to the purple line. And once again, whenever there is a right shift, real GDP would go up. Whenever there is a left shift, real GDP would go down. So, this in some way is similar to what we have discussed under wages, right. Higher cost of production driven by higher input price would take aggregate supply down. Lower cost of production driven by lower input price would take the aggregate supply up. Now, these are the three factors that can shift the short run aggregate supply curve either to the right or to the left. Now, whenever you have any increase in the short run aggregate supply, whenever you have an increase in short run aggregate supply, that means you have a right shift that is called a positive supply shock. If you remember, on the demand side we had talked about positive demand shock. A right shift of the AD is called the positive demand shock. A right shift of SRAS is called a positive supply shock. Similarly, if the short run aggregate supply decreases such that you see a left shift of that curve, then that is called a negative supply shock. And we will come back to these supply and demand shocks. But before that, let me go back to where I was before we started talking about shifts. That means let us go back to here, the short run aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply. Why do we have a difference between the two and what do we mean by the two? Okay. Now, when it comes to supply, there is significant amount of time that is taken by an economy to adjust its supply, because most of the factor prices, most of the prices of inputs and especially wages takes time to adjust. Okay, we know this is also known as stickiness of wages. Wages in an economy are sticky. Wages take time to adjust, wages take time to go up or go down, and it is precisely due to this stickiness of factor prices especially wages, that we see a difference between short run and long run when it comes to aggregate supply. Now, long run aggregate supply is basically the target of the economy. That is the target aggregate supply of the economy. That is where the economy wants to go to. Whereas short run aggregate supply is precisely where the economy is right now. Okay. So, long run aggregate supply is like the goal of the economy. That is the aggregate supply that the economy wants to achieve. The short run aggregate supply is the actual aggregate supply of the economy at this point in time during the current accounting period. Okay. Now, what is the difference between short run and long run? Short run is basically a time period when one of the factors of production is fixed and one is variable. So, at least one factor is fixed. If you are using labor and capital, then capital is fixed and labor is usually the variable input. However, when we are talking about long run is a time period when all factors of production are variable. Okay. Think about it a little simplistically. If you have a business, okay, if you have a business and you start up with one machine in the business to produce whatever you are producing, maybe shirts, okay, and you start it with one machine and one worker, right. Now, if you want to expand your business, it is always easier to hire a new worker than buy a new machine, which means it is easier to add to labor than to add to capital. So, that is why in the short run, labor is the variable input. It is the one which is being replaced and it is being increased or decreased, but capital is the one which remains fixed in the short run. In the long run, both inputs become variable, and that is the precise difference between a short run and a long run. Remember, it is not measured or it is not defined in terms of unit of time. That means we cannot say that short run is 6 months and long run is 10 years, or short run is 2 years and long run is 10 years. So, it is not indicated or defined in units of time, but it is simply defined in terms of whether you have all factors variable or you have at least one fixed factor. So, if you have at least one factor fixed, that is a short run, and when you have all variable factors, that is the long run. Okay. And the reason that we differentiate between short run and long run in terms of aggregate supply is because on the supply side, when you think about the prices of different inputs, it is sticky, and especially true for wages, which is the price of the input labor. Now, next let us talk about the shape of the short run and the long run aggregate supply. Okay. And in this context, we will eventually also bring in the aggregate demand, and we will talk about the equilibrium in the macroeconomy. Okay. So, that is what we are going to cover next. We are going to look at the shape of the SRAS, which is basically this upward sloping. We are going to look at the shape of the long run aggregate supply, and then we are going to bring in aggregate demand, and we will look at the equilibrium in the macro economy. Okay. So, let us see what is the difference really between short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply visually, right. When you look at them, how do you know this is the short run and this is the long run? Okay. So, let us draw the two-dimensional space. So, you have real GDP here, all that is still the same. You have the price index here, something similar to the GDP deflator. This is your short run, this is your aggregate demand, right. That is your downward sloping aggregate demand. Your upward sloping short run aggregate supply, SRAS, and then you have the long run aggregate supply. Now, your long run aggregate supply does not look similar to the short run aggregate supply. The long run aggregate supply is actually a vertical straight line, LRAS, which basically means that no matter what happens to the price index, the real GDP of the economy is fixed. That is what that vertical line means, that no matter what happens to the price level in the economy, whether you have inflation or deflation, there is no change in the real GDP of the economy. So, in some sense, you can understand that that is possible, that is a possibility only if your country has reached the maximum achievable real GDP. it has reached its true potential. It has used all its resources, it has used all its available inputs optimally such that it has reached its objective or goal, or let's say potential. Okay. So that's why this real GDP corresponding to the long run aggregate supply, this is also known as potential real GDP, YP, potential real GDP. This basically means this is the maximum achievable target for the economy. Sometimes this is also known as full employment real GDP. By full employment real GDP, we mean that all factors of production, all inputs in the economy have been optimally used. There is no underutilization or overutilization of resources or inputs in the economy. That means everyone willing and able to work has a job, all factors have been used optimally. So you can understand that that's a pretty hypothetical situation for any country, right, to achieve full employment, right, where everyone willing and able to work has a job. How many times do you see that there is zero unemployment in a country? Not really a very realistic situation. Then you could ask me, the next question that could come up is, then why do we need to talk about a situation that is hypothetical? We need this because basically this YP and the long run aggregate supply basically gives you a benchmark, it gives you a yardstick and helps you to analyze and understand the current situation of the economy. That is, where do we stand right now, how far are we from our goal. Okay. So let's say your target in Eco 600, your target score in Eco 600 is a 95. You want to earn a 95 out of 100, right? And you end up earning a 94, which means you just fall short 1 point of your target, of your your final goal that you had set for yourself. However, if you earn a 65, it means you are 30 away from your final goal, and that does say something about your performance in the course. If you are at 94, it means you were almost there at your goal, so you did really well, you just fell short of 1 point. Whereas if you got a 65, it means you really did not perform well as per your expectation, you fell short by 30 odd points. Okay. So the same thing here, the long run aggregate supply helps as a yardstick, as a benchmark, that is where the economy wants to head to eventually, and helps you understand the situation of the economy in the current period. Now, the current period aggregate supply is basically the short run aggregate supply. That is what the economy has right now. That is the current period aggregate supply for the economy. Okay. And this is of course the aggregate demand in the current period. So you will have an intersection point of the short run aggregate supply with the aggregate demand curve, one unique intersection point, and that intersection point is the short run equilibrium of the economy, SRE, the short run equilibrium. Very important, short run equilibrium, SRE. Okay. And corresponding to that SRE, you have the current price index of the economy P star, and you have the current real GDP of the economy Y star, and I will call that Y1 star for a reason. Okay, because later on I am also going to have a Y2 star. Okay. So that means this Y1 star is the actual real GDP of the economy. That is where the economy is right now in the current accounting period. And YP is the potential, that is where the economy wants to go eventually. Okay. So that means the economy eventually wants to move in that direction. It wants to go rightward. Okay. Now, we could also have a short run equilibrium that looks something like this. So we could have an aggregate demand curve and a short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. So and your economy could be somewhere here. So that could be the price index, and instead of Y1 star, you could have the actual real GDP as Y2 star. Okay. So I am not saying that the economy is in this short run equilibrium or that short run equilibrium at the same time. These are two alternative possibilities. Please understand carefully. So either your economy could be in a situation like SRE1, okay, or alternatively it could be in a situation like SRE2, right, in the short run. That means during the current period. It could be either below full employment level, it could be below its potential, or it could be above full employment level, that means above its potential. Here it refers to underutilization of resources, that means some resources in the country are sitting idle, okay, there is unemployment, whereas there is overutilization of resources, and you could think about a situation where people not only have one job but multiple jobs, that means the unemployment is not zero but negative, okay. It might seem unrealistic, but here we are just talking about theory, so those are both, the two are both the two theoretical possibilities. These are the two theoretical alternatives that are available for the economy. But what is important for you to understand here, that both these, whether it is on the left or on the right of the long run aggregate supply curve, these represent a short run equilibrium. So, a short run equilibrium is an intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve. I repeat, the short run equilibrium SRE is always an intersection point of the aggregate demand curve AD and a short run aggregate supply curve SRAS. Okay? So, it is always going to be away from that vertical line. A short run equilibrium will be either to the left or to the right of a long run aggregate supply curve. And whenever the economy is at a short run equilibrium, whether it is something like SRE1 or SRE2, the objective of the country is to move towards that long run aggregate supply, because that is the potential, that is the optimum for the country. So, if it is away from that vertical line, it wants to move towards that vertical line. So, eventually the country wants to come to a situation like that, where it has an AD curve like this and an SRAS curve that looks like that, so that the short run equilibrium is here. So, this is also a third short run equilibrium, because it is still the intersection point of an AD curve and an SRAS curve, but please note that there is a difference between SRE1, SRE2 and SRE3, and that difference is basically that vertical line. SRE1 and SRE2 do not lie on that vertical line LRAS, whereas SRE3 lies on that vertical line. So, that means this SRE3, this short run equilibrium, is also a long run equilibrium, because it lies on the long run aggregate supply. Okay. So, SRE1 and SRE2 are just short run equilibria, they are not long run equilibria, but SRE3 is a short run equilibria as well as a long run equilibria, because it lies on the potential of the country, it lies on the long run aggregate supply of the country. And at SRE3, the real GDP level of the country is exactly same as the potential, right. So, we could call it Y3 star, the actual real GDP, which is same as the potential real GDP YP. Okay. Is that clear? So, that means the country could be in three alternative situations. It could be somewhere like SRE1, where there is underutilization of resources, the country has a real GDP which is below its potential, like Y1 star. The country could be in a situation like SRE2, where there is overutilization of resources above full employment, and the country has a real GDP Y2 star which is greater than the potential. Okay. Or the country could be in a short run equilibria like SRE3, where it is exactly at its potential, and that kind of an equilibria is also a long run equilibrium. Okay. If the country is at something like SRE1 and SRE2, then the ultimate objective of the country is to move to an equilibria like SRE3 in the long run. That means whenever you are away from that vertical line, your objective is to come to that vertical line. Okay. Now, let us dig in a little bit deeper. So, whenever you are in a situation like this, like SRE1, such that your actual real GDP is less than the potential. So, whenever you are in a situation like this, your Y1 star is less than your YP, your actual real GDP is less than potential, actual is less than potential real GDP, then the gap between the two, the gap between the potential and the actual, this is known as a recessionary gap. The gap in the output, the gap in the real GDP is called recessionary gap. Once again, this will be in terms of dollars, because what we are referring to here is, so you have real GDP here, right? So, and that's in dollars. So what we are saying is that maybe the potential is 1,000 and the actual is $500. So the difference between the two, 1,000 minus 500, that $500 is an output gap. It means your country right now falls short of its potential by $500, and that kind of an output gap is called the recessionary gap. So whenever the short run equilibrium is to the left of the long run aggregate supply, whenever you are in a situation like this, there will always be a recessionary gap in the economy. Okay. Alternatively, if you have a situation like that where your Y2 star is greater than Yp, that means the actual real GDP of the economy is greater than the potential, then the output gap Y2 star minus Yp, that output gap is known as an inflationary gap. Okay. So whenever you are on the right side of that vertical line of the long run aggregate supply, you always have an output gap which is an inflationary gap. Please note that whether you are on the left or you are on the right, whether you are at Y1 star or you are at Y2 star, there is always going to be an output gap. That's always going to be true. Okay. But on the left side, that output gap is called a recessionary gap. On the right side, that output gap is called an inflationary gap. This is for you to remember. Okay. Now let's move a little bit deeper and let's talk a little bit about the shocks that we have been talking about, the shocks to the economy. And then we will come back again, once again, to this diagram and see how the adjustment from short run to long run takes place. So we are left with two more sections in this chapter. We are first going to talk about positive and negative shocks. We are going to talk about positive and negative demand and supply shocks, and then we are going to come back once again to this diagram and we are going to talk about how the process of adjustment from a short run to a long run equilibrium takes place in the economy. So next, let's talk about demand and supply shocks, aggregate demand and supply shocks. Okay. So there could be really four cases. You could have a positive demand shock, you could have a positive supply shock, you could have a negative demand shock, or you could have a negative supply shock. Okay. Now, what do we mean by a positive demand shock? By positive demand shock, we are referring to an increase in aggregate demand with everything else staying the same. No other change, but just aggregate demand has gone up. Maybe the rate of interest has gone down in the economy. As a result of that, interest rate effect has kicked in and aggregate demand has gone up. So we are talking about a right shift of the AD curve. Similarly, the positive supply shock refers to a situation where short run aggregate supply, SRAS, has gone up. Okay. So you see a right shift of the short run aggregate supply. Okay. Similarly, the negative demand shock would refer to a situation where AD has gone down for whatever reason, and negative supply shock would refer to a situation where SRAS has gone down due to situation, maybe something like wage rate in the economy went up, so SRAS went down. So we are talking about left shifts of the AD or AS when we are talking about a negative shock. So basically, a positive shock refers to a right shift of the curves, a negative shock refers to a left shift of the curves depending on which curve we are talking about. Let's see what that means in the diagram. Okay. So we are at a short run equilibrium in the economy. So let's say initially the economy is here at a short run equilibrium. Why is this a short run equilibrium? Because it's an intersection point of a SRAS curve and the AD curve. And this is our real GDP, that's our price index. Similarly here, okay. Now, if you have a positive demand shock, that means you have a right shift of the AD curve, AD dash, right, where you have a new short run equilibrium, let's call that SRE dash. If you have a positive supply shock, that means you have a right shift of the short run aggregate supply curve, so that you have a new short run in equilibrium. Okay. Similarly here, if you have a negative demand shock, you have a left shift of the AD curve. Once again, you have a new short-term equilibrium. Also, if you have a negative supply shock, so that's a left shift of the SRAS curve. So you have a new short-run equilibrium, right? So whenever you have any kind of shock in the economy, you will always have a new AD or a new short-run aggregate supply curve depending on what kind of shock the economy has experienced, and as a result of that you will always have a new short-run equilibrium in the economy. Look at the 4 diagrams. You always have a new short-run equilibrium evolving in the economy. But at the new short-run equilibrium, you could have very different impacts on the price index and the real GDP of the country. Okay? For example, if you have a positive demand shock, then please note that there has been an increase in the real GDP, and at the same time there has been an increase in the price index. So that is what you see, an increase in the real GDP as well as an increase in the price index. So we can say that due to positive demand shock, real GDP goes up and price index goes up. So we can say that there is growth in the economy, and at the same time there is inflation. So one good thing, one desirable thing is happening for the economy, which is growth, and something which is not as desirable, which is inflation. So it's a positive demand shock which is causing one desirable impact on the economy, increase in real GDP, and one undesirable impact, apparently undesirable impact, which is inflation or an increase in the price index. Now, if you have a positive supply shock, something like that, then you have a new equilibrium at which the real GDP is higher, but the price index of the economy is lower. Okay? So here you have a situation where the real GDP of the economy goes up, but the price index of the economy goes down. So that means you have growth on one side and you have deflation on the other. So both are desirable. A positive supply shock creates two desirable things in the economy. It causes growth as well as it causes deflation. Prices are going down and real GDP is going up. It's a great situation for the economy. Okay? Let's look at the negative demand shock. If you look at negative demand shock, then at the new equilibrium, the real GDP is going down and the price index is going down. Okay? So here you have a situation where your RGDP is going down and your price index is going down. So basically you have stagnation and you have deflation. Once again, one is desirable, deflation is desirable, stagnation is not. Okay? And if you have a negative supply shock, once again you have a lower real GDP and you have a higher price index. Okay, so here your real GDP has gone down and your price index has gone up. So you have stagnation and you have inflation. So you have two undesirable things happening at the same time, stagnation and inflation. Please note, when you talk about demand shocks, if you have a positive demand shock or you have a negative demand shock, whatever the case may be, you always have one positive impact and one negative impact on the economy. Whether it is positive demand shock or negative demand shock, there is always one good thing, one undesirable thing happening. For example, for the positive demand shock, growth is a good thing, inflation is not. For the negative demand shock, deflation is a good thing, stagnation is not. So demand shocks, whether it's positive or negative, will always create one good impact, one adverse impact on the economy. Never it will cause both good things and two good things, or it will never cause two bad things. Okay? Let's see what happens in case of supply shocks. When you talk about supply shocks, for positive supply shock, it will create two good things for the economy. Growth and deflation are both good. When you talk in terms of the negative supply shock, it creates both bad things for the economy. So supply shock is either all good or it's all bad. It's never a combination. If it's a positive supply shock, it's all good. If it's a negative supply shock, it's all bad, because it is leading to stagnation as well as inflation in the economy. So if I asked you what is the best kind of shock to the economy, your answer would be this: positive supply shock, because it is creating two good things for the economy. What is the worst kind of shock for the economy is a negative supply shock, because it creates two bad things: stagnation and inflation. Whenever this happens, whenever stagnation and inflation happen together, this is also called stagflation. Stagflation, the two words combined together, stagnation and inflation. Stagflation is a combination of stagnation and inflation. It is a very worse situation for the economy, which is driven by negative supply shock. So the worst kind of shock is negative supply shock, which causes stagflation. Can any other shock cause stagflation? The answer is no, because you can see in these four situations, nothing has caused stagnation and inflation at the same time. So stagflation, which is stagnation and inflation, can only be caused by the supply side through a negative shock on the supply side. That is for you to remember. Okay? So here we have an analysis of the different kind of shocks to the economy, and you can understand that these shocks will be driven either from the demand side or the supply side, depending on what event triggers them. Okay? For example, if I had a financial crisis in the economy, so that the stock market is crashing, the banking institutions are going bankrupt, and a situation like that, it means that people will become consumers and producers, lose faith on the economy. So, we are talking about a pessimism environment in the country. Now, you know, pessimism is something that impacts the demand side. It takes the aggregate demand down. So, that means we are talking about a negative demand shock. We will talk about more specific examples of shocks when we do problem solving on this chapter, but for now this is where we will end. But before we end the chapter, we will go back and see how the adjustment from short run to long run takes place. We will go back to that, and that would kind of wrap up this chapter for us. So, now we will talk about the process of adjustment of an economy from a short run equilibrium to a long run equilibrium. That means if a country is underutilizing or overutilizing its resources, how does it come back or go to its potential? Let us start here. So, we have two kinds of economies that are possible. So, you could have an economy with a recessionary gap, or you could have an economy with an inflationary gap. That means your economy could be on the left hand side of the LRAS, something like this. So, your economy could be in a point like this. Let us call that SRE, that is the short run equilibrium. Let us say that is your actual real GDP, that is the potential real GDP. So, you can clearly see there is an output gap here, okay, and the actual is less than the potential. So, that means we are in a recessionary gap. And that is the price index of the economy. Let us call that P star. Okay. Alternatively, so this is situation 1. Alternatively, you could have a situation of inflationary gap in the economy. That is the potential of the country, and the short run equilibria is located on the right hand side of the long run. So, this is the short run equilibrium, this is the actual real GDP, let us call that Y2 star, and that is the price index of the economy, let us call that P star. Once again, you can see there is an output gap obviously, and that is an inflationary gap because your actual real GDP is greater than the potential. So, that is an inflationary gap. So, those are the two possible situations in the short run for an economy. Those are the two possibilities. The economy is either at a short run or either at a recessionary gap or at an inflationary gap. So, if there is a situation like this, how can the economy go to the long run equilibrium? The process of adjustment of an economy from the short run to the long run equilibrium on its own, okay, the government is not triggering this process. It is not a policy action, but the economy on its own through its forces of demand and supply, how does it go to the long run equilibrium? We are not looking at policy action. That is for another time. When we talk about policies, we will see how this process takes place with the help of policies. But for now, we are not talking about policies. We are saying that, okay, this is the situation in the economy, or that is the situation in the economy. Can something happen very spontaneously, organically in an economy which makes it go towards its potential, makes it adjust to a long run equilibrium? The answer is yes, and the process is called the wage adjustment process. The wage adjustment process is an organic, spontaneous process in the economy which makes the economy adjust from any short run equilibrium to the long run equilibrium. Let us understand the mechanism. Let us concentrate on this diagram first, the recessionary gap. So, you have a recessionary gap, the actual is less than the potential, the real GDP, which means some resources are underutilized. There is unemployment in the country. So, if you think about a real world situation, it means that some people who are willing and able to work do not have jobs. They are waiting in a queue for a job. The number of jobs available are less than the number of people who are willing to do that job. Now, what would happen to wages in that kind of a situation? Obviously, in that kind of a situation, the wages in the country would go down, isn't it? Because there are so many people to take the job and there are less jobs available. So that would put a downward pressure on the wages in the economy. As soon as there is downward pressure on the wages, that would imply that cost of production goes down. And as cost of production goes down, you know that that is something that will take aggregate supply up. We just discussed that today, that it is going to take the short run aggregate supply up, or it is going to cause a right shift of the short run aggregate supply curve. Please note that this is happening organically. Nobody is decreasing the wages. It is not an exogenous change. It's an endogenous change. By endogenous, I mean it is happening within the economy organically, spontaneously. Because there is unemployment, that's why the wages are going down over time. That's why there is decrease in cost of production, and that's why there is an increase in the short run aggregate supply. Please be very clear about this. This is not a policy action, or this is not being created by someone. This is an organic, spontaneous process happening in the economy given the situation in the economy. Okay? So as soon as that happens, an increase in short run aggregate supply, that means this short run aggregate supply is going to shift rightward, and that shift is going to continue. It is going to continue until that short run aggregate supply comes to the point where it reaches a situation like this, and you have a new equilibrium established in the economy. Please note that this new equilibrium is a short run equilibrium because it is at the intersection point of AD and the new SRAS curve, but it is also a long run equilibrium because it lies on that vertical line. Okay? So that means the country has moved from a pure short run equilibrium to another short run equilibrium, which is also a long run equilibrium, and that adjustment process has taken place because here your actual real GDP is actually equal to the potential. If I can call that Y1 star dash, your Y1 star dash is the same as your YP. So this output gap that was there in the economy has got wiped out, and also as a result of it there has been deflation in the economy. The price index has gone down. So that is the adjustment process that you have whenever there is a recessionary gap. That is the reason that when you have a small recession in a country, when you have small output gaps, over time it can take care of itself. The country can take care of itself because this adjustment process can take place on its own. No policy action is necessary. Okay, and this happens in the economy all the time. Alternatively, if there was an inflationary gap, if the country was overutilizing its resources, that means in the real world you have a situation like negative unemployment rate. That means people not only have one job, but they will have multiple jobs available to them. And if you are in a situation like that, what would you do? You would take up the job where you have higher wages, right? Where you get maximum wages. So in a situation like this, the wages in the country will be rising because people have multiple jobs available to them. As wages increase, the cost of production increases. As cost of production increases, we know that short run aggregate supply would be going down because it is now difficult to produce. So SRAS would be going down, so you would see a left shift of the SRAS curve. So that means now this curve starts moving leftward, and this shift will continue until it comes to a situation like that. The wage adjustment process will continue until the economy moves back to a point like that. And please note that this is a short run equilibrium because it is at the intersection point of AD and the new SRAS, but it's also a long run equilibrium because it lies on that vertical line, isn't it? And as that shift happens, you have your new real GDP Y2 star dash, which is the same as YP. It's the same thing as YP. So that means that inflationary gap that was there has got wiped out through this adjustment process, and as a consequence there has been inflation created in the economy. Okay. So, no matter whether there is recessionary gap or there is inflationary gap, there is a wage adjustment process that takes place organically in the economy. In case of recessionary gap, the wages go down. In case of inflationary gap, the wages go up, as a result of which the short run aggregate supply either shift right or it shifts left, and the economy goes back to a long run equilibrium. Okay. In case of recessionary gap, the adjustment process would cause a deflation in the economy. It would create deflationary pressure. In case of inflationary gap, that adjustment process would create an inflationary pressure on the economy. However, no matter which gap you have, the ultimate objective of the economy is to come back to that vertical line. If it is here, then the objective is to move rightward, go that way. If it is there, then the objective of the economy is to come leftward. So, no economy wants to stay in a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap. The ultimate objective is to come to the potential real GDP. The ultimate objective is to come to a long run equilibrium. So, that wraps up this chapter. Now, in the next chapter, we are going to talk about how this adjustment process from short run to long run could take place through macroeconomic policies, and we will talk in detail about fiscal policy and monetary policy.